The year is 1305. London wakes with a strange, fevered pulse, its cobbled streets normally alive with merchants hawking their wares and peasants rushing about their daily toil, stir with something different, something darker, from the highest noble to the lowliest beggar. Every soul in the city has heard whispers of the event that will unfold today. The air itself is heavy, almost metallic with anticipation. It is not an ordinary morning. It is not a market day. It is not a festival. It is an execution, but not just any execution. Today, London will watch the death of a man who has defied an empire, a man whose name has spread like wildfire across Scotland and into the very heart of England, a man who has forced kings, nobles, and generals alike to tremble in humiliation. Today, William Wallace, rebel, warrior, outlaw, legend, will die. The crowds gather early, cramming into the streets until no cobblestone is visible beneath the boots of thousands. Some are here to jeer, some to gawk, some to glory in the vengeance of their king, and yet some stand silently, their faces unreadable, for even here, even in the capital of England, there are those who whisper that the man condemned is no mere criminal, but a patriot who dared to fight for his people. The smell of London is overpowering: sweat, dung, stale ale, and the sourness of too many bodies pressed together. Yet beneath it all lingers another scent: excitement laced with cruelty. This is not justice. It is theater, a spectacle designed to sear terror into the hearts of every subject who might dare think of rebellion. From the dark stone chambers of Westminster Hall, movement stirs, shackled, emaciated, his once mighty frame reduced by months of chains and hunger. William Wallace emerges into the light. His hair is matted, his clothes torn, his body bruised and filthy, and yet his eyes burn. Those who meet his gaze see no submission, no broken spirit. They see fire, defiance, a man who may lose his body today, but not his soul. The roar of the crowd crashes down like thunder. Some hurl insults, others spit. Children shriek with gleeful cruelty. But above the noise, above the hatred, Wallace walks, slowly, proudly. This is no ordinary man. This is Scotland's nightmare made flesh for Edward Longshanks, Hammer of the Scots. And today, the king will have his vengeance. Forget the tales of romance. Forget the Hollywood ending, where the hero dies with a whisper of freedom upon his lips. The truth is far more savage. William Wallace will not be given a warrior's death. He will not be allowed mercy, nor dignity. His end will be drawn out with a cruelty designed to annihilate his body, his memory, his very humanity. For this is not simply an execution. It is a ritual, a punishment reserved for traitors, for those who dared to defy the sacred order of king and country. Wallace's flesh will be torn, his innards burned before his eyes, his body quartered, scattered across the realm, his head spiked upon London Bridge, a warning that rebellion will be met not merely with death, but with obliteration. The people wait. The executioners sharpen their blades. The king's justice has prepared its stage, and in the center of it all stands a man who will endure one of the most horrifying deaths in history. This is the execution of William Wallace. To understand why William Wallace's death became a theater of cruelty, we must first step back into the land that shaped him and the chaos that birthed his rebellion. Wallace was born around 1270 in Elderslie, a modest village in Scotland. Unlike the noble heirs who filled castles with silk and feasts, Wallace came from humbler stock. His father was a minor knight or landholder, a man of little power, and Wallace's youth was not gilded by privilege. Yet from the beginning, he stood apart. Wallace was said to be tall, immensely strong, and quick-tempered. In an age where survival depended on muscle and grit, he possessed both in abundance. But it was not only his size that marked him, it was his spirit. Wallace lived in a time when Scotland itself was in turmoil. The death of King Alexander III in 1286 threw the kingdom into chaos. With no clear heir, rival claimants clawed for the throne. Into this void strode Edward I of England, known as Edward Longshanks. A king of towering ambition, Edward saw Scotland not as a neighbor, but as a prize. He demanded its nobles bow to him. Many did. They bent the knee, signed oaths, and accepted English overlordship. But not Wallace. Where others saw survival in submission, Wallace saw only humiliation. He was not a man of treaties and parchment. He was a man of sword and steel, and his loyalty lay not with England, but with Scotland's freedom. Legend tells of the moment Wallace's personal war began. In Lanark, English soldiers reportedly killed his wife, a woman named Marion Braidfute. Whether by official execution or a cruel act of vengeance, her death ignited something in Wallace. He struck back with a ferocity that stunned those around him. Gathering a small band of men, Wallace stormed the English garrison, killing its commander and leaving a trail of corpses. It was not a battle, but a massacre, and it sent a message across Scotland. Here was a man unafraid to fight the conquerors. The English branded him an outlaw. To the Scots, he became a symbol. His rebellion was not born in parliaments or royal courts, but in blood and vengeance. Every act of defiance drew more men to his side. Farmers, peasants, disinherited knights. They saw in Wallace not just a leader, but a reflection of their own anger. And soon his defiance would erupt into open war. By 1297, Wallace's name was known throughout the land. Scotland bled under English occupation, its people taxed, its nobles divided, its spirit crushed. But Wallace offered something no one else could: hope. That year, he and his growing force turned their eyes to Stirling, a strategic crossing point over the River Forth. There, the English army, led by Hugh de Cressingham, prepared to crush him. Outnumbered, outarmed, outmatched, Wallace should have been annihilated, but he was not a man who fought on the enemy's terms. On the 11th of September, 1297, the Battle of Stirling Bridge would prove that Wallace was more than an outlaw. He was a tactician, a commander, a man who could stare down England's might and win. As the English knights attempted to cross the narrow wooden bridge, Wallace struck. His men waited, disciplined and silent, until the enemy clogged the passageway. Then, with a roar, the Scots charged. Hemmed in by the river on both sides, the English forces were trapped. Chaos erupted. Horses stumbled, knights drowned, soldiers were hacked down mercilessly. It was a slaughter. Thousands of Englishmen fell, and when the blood finally ceased to flow, Scotland had won one of its greatest victories. For the first time, Wallace's rebellion was no longer a bandit's war. It was a national movement. He was hailed guardian of Scotland, protector of a nation that longed for freedom. For a moment, a fleeting, brilliant moment, it seemed Scotland might break its chains. But freedom has never been cheaply bought. Edward Longshanks was not a man who tolerated humiliation. His fury was legendary. To be defied, to be beaten by a so-called outlaw, was an insult he could not forgive. The following year, at Falkirk in 1298,
Edward struck back with overwhelming force. His longbowmen shredded Wallace's formations. The Scottish cavalry faltered. The victory at Stirling was erased in blood. Wallace's army was destroyed. He resigned his guardianship and slipped into the shadows, a fugitive once more. But though his role as commander was ended, his role as symbol only grew stronger. Wallace was hunted, branded, despised by England, and yet to the Scots, he became something greater than any title. The man who refused to bow. And so William Wallace lived, not as a general, but as a ghost, moving through the land in secret, appearing suddenly to strike at English forces, vanishing before they could catch him. His very survival became an act of defiance. For years he eluded capture, but every outlaw's story ends the same way, and for Wallace that end would come, not on the battlefield, but through betrayal.
The story of William Wallace cannot be told without standing at the banks of the River Forth, where on one September morning in 1297, Scotland changed the course of its history. Picture it, the cold mist rolling across the fields, the morning air heavy with dampness, and the metallic scent of river water. In the distance, the wooden span of Stirling Bridge stretches narrow and fragile across the swirling Forth. Beneath that fragile structure waits destiny. On one side, an English host, clad in iron and arrogance, a machine of war that has crushed rebellion across Wales, France, and Scotland alike. On the other, a ragged army of Scots, barefoot men, farmers wielding axes, and knights with battered armor. And at their head, a man branded outlaw, William Wallace. The English came with numbers on their side. Estimates put their force between 8,000 and 12,000, including heavy cavalry, armored knights, infantry, and archers. Against them stood Wallace and Andrew Moray, commanding perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 Scots. Outnumbered, outarmed, their defeat seemed certain. But Wallace understood something Edward's generals did not. War is not simply numbers, but ground, timing, and will. The wooden bridge at Stirling was narrow, so narrow that only a few men could cross abreast. For an army that relied on cavalry charges and the crushing weight of armored knights, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. The morning began with English confidence. When morning began with English confidence, Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, and John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, believed the Scots to be nothing but rabble. Why delay? Why negotiate? The Scots would be swept aside like chaff before the wind. They ordered the advance. The first waves of English soldiers began their crossing. Horses clattered, hooves shaking the bridge's planks. The river churned below, its cold water unforgiving. Slowly the English trickled across. Wallace waited. He did not move. His men, though restless, held their discipline. They watched, silent as wolves, as their prey walked into the killing ground. When nearly half of the English force had crossed, Wallace struck. From the high ground near Abbey Craig, he gave the signal. The Scots surged forward, their cries ripping through the mist like thunder. Pikes bristled in formation. Axes and swords gleamed. The English, caught between the river on one side and the bridge on the other, were trapped. The slaughter was merciless. Horses reared and toppled into the Forth, drowning knights under the weight of their own armor. Infantrymen, hemmed in with no room to maneuver, were hacked down in swathes. The bridge itself became a death trap, collapsing under the chaos. English soldiers, desperate to flee, trampled one another, their screams echoing across the valley. Hugh de Cressingham, the architect of English arrogance, was killed in the melee. Legend says the Scots, hating him for his cruelty and greed,
flayed his body and fashioned strips of his skin into sword belts. Whether truth or myth, it reveals the depth of Scottish fury that day. By the time the battle ended, thousands of English lay dead. Wallace and Moray had achieved the unthinkable. They had destroyed a superior English force and secured one of the most resounding victories in Scottish history. For Scotland, Stirling Bridge was more than a battle. It was a statement. For the first time, the English machine of conquest had been stopped, not by nobles in negotiation, but by common men wielding courage and steel. Wallace was no longer a fugitive in the shadows. He was a commander of armies, a guardian of his people. The victory electrified Scotland. Villages rang with the news. Songs were sung, prayers whispered, banners raised. Men flocked to Wallace's side, swelling his ranks. The Scots declared him Guardian of Scotland, a title that placed him at the helm of a nation yearning for independence. But victories are fragile things, and glory is fleeting. Wallace, though triumphant, now bore the weight of a crownless kingdom. He faced not only the might of Edward Longshanks, but also the treachery of Scottish nobles, who still bent the knee to England. Stirling Bridge was a spark, but sparks can be smothered if fire does not follow. Edward would not forgive this humiliation. Across England, whispers spread of the defeat. A king who had crushed Welsh princes, who had humbled French kings, had been beaten by an outlaw. Longshanks, far away in Flanders at the time, seethed with fury. He vowed not merely to defeat Wallace, but to annihilate him. And so, when Edward returned in 1298, he brought with him a host unlike any Scotland had yet seen. At Falkirk, Wallace's triumph would turn to ruin. The English longbow, a weapon of terrible range and precision, shredded the Scottish formations. Wallace's pikemen, once so formidable, were cut down in waves. The cavalry fled. The battle lost. Stirling Bridge had shown the world that Wallace could win. Falkirk showed that even the bravest rebels could bleed. And yet, even in defeat, Wallace's legend grew. He resigned as guardian, slipping once more into the shadows. But the memory of Stirling lived on. It was proof that England's yoke could be broken. It was the seed of rebellion that would grow, watered by Wallace's blood. For now he remained hunted, but Edward's vengeance was far from finished. The king wanted more than Wallace's capture. He wanted him erased, and to do that he would need not the strength of armies, but the poison of betrayal.
For Edward I of England, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, William Wallace was more than just a man. He was a wound, a scar on the king's pride that no crown or conquest could cover. Edward was a king forged of iron, towering, ruthless, feared across Europe. He had bent nations to his will. He had subdued Wales with castles of stone and rivers of blood. He had forced French kings to the negotiating table. He had made Scotland's nobles bow before him. But Wallace, this outlaw, this upstart of no royal blood, had defied him. Worse, Wallace had beaten him. To Edward, that was intolerable. Kings, after all, ruled not only with armies, but with fear. The authority of a monarch was more than a crown. It was a presence, a shadow that stretched across every subject, whispering obedience into their bones. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge had torn a hole in that shadow. It had shown that even the mighty armies of England could fall, that defiance was possible. And once such a thought enters the hearts of men, it spreads like wildfire. Edward understood this better than anyone. He knew that rebellions are not born from weapons, but from symbols, and Wallace had become the greatest symbol of all. That is why his death could not be ordinary. No, Edward could not simply order Wallace's head struck off with a sword, a clean death would elevate him. It might turn him into a martyr. No, what Edward required was a spectacle, a ritual of such unimaginable cruelty that it would burn itself into the memory of all who watched, an execution so terrible that it would annihilate not only the man, but the very idea of resistance. In medieval England, there was one punishment reserved for those who committed the gravest of crimes, treason, and treason in the eyes of the law was not merely a betrayal of king or country. It was the destruction of order itself. It was chaos, rebellion, the tearing of the divine fabric of society. For such a crime, death alone was insufficient. The guilty had to be unmade. Thus came the punishment that chilled even hardened men to the bone, hanging, drawing, and quartering. It was not a single act, but a sequence, a carefully staged theater of agony. First, the condemned would be drawn to the place of execution, dragged through the streets, tied to a hurdle or sled, filth smeared upon their body, their dignity stripped away. It was a procession of humiliation, ensuring that every man, woman, and child saw the traitor debased. Next came the hanging. A noose would be placed around the victim's neck, and they would be suspended until nearly dead, gasping, choking, body convulsing, but not allowed the mercy of death. Just as unconsciousness clawed at their mind, they would be cut down, revived for the torment yet to come. Then came the most horrifying part, the drawing out of entrails. The executioner would slice open the abdomen, spilling the victim's bowels. Piece by piece, their intestines would be pulled out, often while still alive, and burned before their eyes. The smell of searing flesh, the screams of the dying. This was no accident. It was designed to horrify the spectators as much as the victim. Finally, when agony had done its work, the victim would be quartered, the head severed, the body cut into 4 parts, each piece sent to different corners of the realm, nailed to gates, displayed as warnings. The head itself was tarred and placed upon a spike, most often above London Bridge, where thousands would see it daily. This was not justice. It was ritualized terror, and it was the fate Edward decreed for William Wallace. But the king wanted more than the act itself. He wanted theatrics. Wallace's capture had to be public. His trial had to be staged. His execution had to draw crowds large enough that word of his fate would spread across Britain. Edward did not want Wallace to simply die. He wanted him to vanish in screams, in fire, in fragments scattered to the wind. So when Wallace was finally betrayed and seized, Edward's satisfaction was not quiet. It was the glee of a predator who had hunted his prey for years and at last had it in his claws. The king, by then aging and ill, saw in Wallace not a man but an opportunity, one final act of dominance that would echo through history. But Edward underestimated something, for symbols are not so easily destroyed. A man's body can be broken, his flesh can be flayed, his head can be dipped in tar, but ideas do not bleed. Edward's need for blood would birth one of the most horrifying executions the world has ever seen. And yet, instead of erasing Wallace, it would immortalize him. The stage was set. All that remained was betrayal. William Wallace's life ended not with the dignity of a warrior's death on the battlefield, but with the shrieks of agony echoing across Smithfield. His flesh was torn, his entrails burned, his body quartered, his head left to rot above London Bridge. By every measure of earthly power, he was destroyed. His body became nothing more than a warning, a gruesome display of what happens when a man dares to defy a king. And yet, Wallace endures, not in bone nor in blood, nor in the remnants scattered across England and Scotland, but in memory, in story, in the unquenchable fire of an idea. For Edward Longshanks had sought to annihilate not merely a man, but a symbol, and in so doing, he forged something greater than either of them could have imagined. Think of Wallace not at the scaffold, but at Stirling Bridge. Picture him at the head of men who had nothing but courage and crude weapons, staring down the mailed fists of England's knights. Think of the moment when those knights drowned in the Forth, and the banner of Scotland flew high. That image, more than the screams of Smithfield, became eternal. Edward believed terror could break a people. He believed that fear was stronger than hope, that cruelty could extinguish courage. But the truth of Wallace's story proves otherwise. Fear may silence voices for a time. Cruelty may break bodies. But ideas, the idea of freedom, of self-rule, of dignity, cannot be killed, not by ropes, nor by fire, nor by axes. Wallace's end was monstrous. There is no denying the horror of it. He did not pass from this world gently. He did not whisper noble words in peace. He died as any man would under such torment, screaming, gasping, writhing in agony. And perhaps that truth is more powerful than the sanitized myths, for it reminds us that heroes are not gods, but men, flesh and blood, vulnerable, mortal, terrified, and yet willing to endure the worst of humanity's cruelty for something greater than themselves. That is the true legacy of William Wallace, not invulnerability, not perfection, but defiance. The English placed his head above London Bridge as a warning, but every traveler who saw it carried the story north. His quarters dangled on gates in Newcastle, Stirling, Berwick, and Perth, but each fragment only deepened the legend. Instead of being erased, Wallace became everywhere. His absence was his presence. His silence was louder than his screams. Generations later, the Scots would still invoke his name. Robert the Bruce would fight under the shadow of his sacrifice. Poets and bards would weave his story into song. Mothers would tell their children of the man who stood against the might of England and would not bend. Even centuries on, Wallace remains not just a historical figure, but a symbol of something universal, the unbreakable will of the oppressed. We must not forget the horror either. To romanticize Wallace's death as a simple act of noble martyrdom is to miss the truth. His end was designed to terrify, and it did terrify. It showed the depths of cruelty that power can sink to when threatened. It showed how far kings will go to silence rebellion. It showed that the machinery of justice can be twisted into a weapon of terror. And in remembering that horror, we remain vigilant against it in our own time. For Wallace's execution is not only the story of one man, it is the story of all who have stood against tyranny, all who have been crushed by empires, all who have suffered so that others might be free. His screams at Smithfield echo with the voices of countless others across history who endured suffering for the sake of freedom. And so, when we remember William Wallace, we must remember him fully, not as Hollywood paints him, but as he truly was, a man of towering courage and violent temper, a warrior who won great victories and suffered crushing defeats, a rebel who defied a king and paid the ultimate price, a man who died in unspeakable agony, and through that agony became immortal. The Scots have a saying, "They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom."
The phrase is a romantic echo of Wallace's defiance, but the truth is deeper. Freedom was not born in noble speeches or triumphant charges. It was born in the grit of men like Wallace, who suffered, who endured, who refused to surrender, even when the world fell upon them. William Wallace's body lies scattered in dust and memory, but his spirit, that unbroken, unyielding spirit, rides still on the winds of Scotland, across the highlands, through the glens, along the battlements of Stirling and Bannockburn. He endures in stone statues, in songs, in stories, but most of all in the hearts of those who believe that no power, however mighty, can chain the will of a people forever. And so we remember him not as he died torn apart on Edward's scaffold, but as he lived defiant, fierce, unbroken, a man who became an idea that no king, no